So when Tina asked me to do this, I immediately said yes because I was delighted to be asked, and then found out, I think 3 or 4 weeks later, that the theme was ink. And it was amazing to me because I'm all about ink. I've lived a life in ink. And when I thought about the word ink and all the things I've made that are just ink, on paper, usually, I started thinking about the value and the ephemeral quality of design and how things disappear. And yet, when ink was sold, when I was growing up, an advertisement for it always included a word that was indelible, which is making marks that cannot be removed. And it's funny that we live in a profession that's essentially ephemeral, and yet ink is described as indelible. So I started thinking about my own work over 40 years, and sort of the different kinds of ink I worked in, and the ways I felt about it. I began as a record cover designer, for those of you who don't know, and everything was 4-color press ink. And what led me into being a record cover designer was this cover, which I saw when I was in high school. And I wanted to re-achieve it. And here's my own self-portrait done like the Revolver cover. And a piece of work from my future husband, Seymour Quast, who worked with all types of eclectic typography. This is Victorian influenced, and here's a cover I did in ink in 1974 for Charles Mingus. And these things actually still remain. These covers I designed that were typographic, that were objects that were inlaid, photographed from glass, large-scale photographs of covers on 12¼ by 12¼ surfaces, sometimes opening up, including the back covers filled with ink. I made about a mile of these from 1974 to 1982. And I look at them now. The ones I've shown you, and I'm showing you, were just collected by MoMA, and we didn't have a lot of them. We had to buy them back off eBay. They're temporary. They were never expected to last. You didn't think about it that way. Some of these things I love. Some of these things I forgot about. Some of these things I thought I never did better. Some of these things I don't remember ever doing. And some of them define me. Recently, my partner Abbott Miller is doing a 50th anniversary exhibit for the Rolling Stones, and the curator on the show, a woman named Eileen Gallagher, found this mechanical packed in the Rolling Stone archive for a poster I forgot I ever did. Here's a 4-color reproduction with my name and address and phone numbers from where I lived in 1982. I love that's still there. In the 80s, I lived on Xerox ink. We all did. It defined the profession. We made things, we cut them up and moved them around. I would Xerox typefaces and put them together by hand, and then they'd be photocopied, and then they'd be printed. I even published my collection of them, things I had bought in antique stores that I laid out from Xeroxes on sheets that were sold, and they weren't sold, they were distributed from Champion Papers in a collection called Beautiful Faces. This is the mechanicals for some of them. Some of these still exist. I renamed some of them, and you can tell when they were mine from the name. And then I did the same thing with dingbats, collections that were photocopied out of books or Xeroxed or put together by hand, little teeny-weeny mechanicals with little teeny-weeny numbers. And sometimes we just blew things up on the Xerox machine. The Xerox machine defined David Carson. If you go back and look at his work, it wouldn't have existed with this kind of printing technology, reproduced off Xeroxes. I think my favorite from the period was this big A poster that I did when I got my first 11 by 17 Xerox machine. And if you look at where the tape is, it was the 11 by 17 piece of the A pieced together with the tape. Nobody would understand that now because you don't do it. Who would? It's sort of idiotic. But it was fantastic at the time. For me, making things was what really mattered. Things I made by hand, crazy charts I made up, things I wrote about, things that were political, things that were nonsensical, all done either by hand or cutting things up or from things I felt or believed, crazy charts, and mostly my ink was being in print in places that people saw. I like to be in the New York Times. I still to this day will drop anything if Nicholas Bleckman calls me up and asks me to do a book review cover. I don't care what I'm working on. There's something so immediate about it. You do something, it's in the newspaper the next day. How great is that? I'll do it in a minute. Just call me. Silkscreen ink was really the best ink of all, I think, for graphic designer because the color is so solid. Nothing like silkscreen ink on a piece of paper. God, is that beautiful. God, does that smell beautiful. And I did those things and tried to sell them. I made a number system, just black and white with like little bits of process colors that were silkscreen ink beneath it that we tried to sell. The silkscreen printer still has them. I don't know where they are. I don't have a million copies, but he does somewhere. And I never worried about what would happen or if other people would steal them or rip them off because it was really about the pleasure of making them. A glass house poster for Philip Johnson's glass house that they still sell and make money on and that I just donated to them because I liked the idea of making it. Silkscreen series for the Type Directors Club that I took so I could make the posters, the only reason to do the job. When I looked at all the stuff I pulled, I realized that 90% of the work I do that I love is for free. And I don't even know how to value it or think about it, and yet it stays around, things that people know. The Cooper Hewitt had taken this and they'd asked me for copies because they're having a poster show and they wanted to sell work. And I had done this for a guy named Rob Forbes who started Public Bikes in San Francisco as a favor. And I went to call him because we didn't have any copies of it and found out he was selling them for $350. I had no idea. These guys actually paid me. I think this happened last year where somebody commissioned me to make posters for sale for the National Theatre in London, a first. So maybe it's not impossible. I think my favorite ink of all is what I'd call New York ink. New York ink is being able to coat the city of New York with ink. The first experience was a subway poster I did for the School of Visual Arts. And when it ran on the D line, someone in Brooklyn had gotten out and sort of blacked out the forefinger in Winston Churchill. And they did it in every single subway stop. It was my first interactive piece of work. After that, I was hooked. I just wanted to work in the subways. If you make posters for the subways, and in the 90s, there was actually a policy that gave not-for-profits a real reduction in rates so they could afford to do it. I felt like New York City was my gallery. These are posters I did for Ballet Tech who could no longer afford to do these in 2000s because they couldn't afford to pay for the space after it was raised. And now sometimes the space is rare and doesn't exist at all. And the biggest ink coder was the Public Theater and still is. We made posters initially for each play that was released. They were printed in silkscreen, but there was no place to hang them because there was no surface that really existed. They mostly existed at the public, except for the Shakespeare in the Parks, where the city contributed to the space because it was free Shakespeare. And every summer, these exist all over the city. The other posters were mostly sniped when we can afford it, with the exception of Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk, which was probably my biggest mass coding of my life, where every surface of New York found a place for this. It was quite astounding because you felt like you were living and breathing in your own work on a daily basis. Now the posters that exist on the individual plays of the public are all digital, but we continue with the Shakespeare things, and we use the basis of the poster for Shakespeare in the Park as a system to do digital designs for the rest of the year. People call me for these, and they want to buy them, and I always try to find out what about the poster resonated with them, and I find it's really not about the graphic design, it's about the way they saw the graphic design, that they were just meeting the person they were going to marry, or they just moved to New York and the poster was across the street, or some emblematic experience that involved confronting this thing that lives outside, that has questionable value and is ephemeral. Now the posters live in front of the public theater, and as I said, we take the summer poster and use whatever the graphic treatment is as a basis for doing the whole season. This is this year's season, and all the little stuff. And we're currently working on the one that'll launch in May, and this is what this one looks like, so here it comes. But at the public, the digital display by Ben Rubin is front and center, and the posters are locked up behind glass, sort of a relic of the past. Around 2000 to 2004, I started to realize that what interested me most was always going to be things that were real, that were solid, that were not virtual, and that I began working in three-dimensional design and in environmental graphics. And the way I handled these was really sort of like making giant posters that just wrapped around buildings. It was my initial way of designing these things before I became sculptural. And the way we designed these was to make Photoshop renderings and print them out big as digital prints. There was nothing like a digital plotter to see what something was going to look like at size, even though these things tended to be painted. They coded buildings, they made slogans, they functioned like posters, they told you where the bathroom was, they told you how far you had to walk, or how long you had to wait. They coded garages, and yet, when we began to become dimensional, as in Bloomberg's headquarters, there's a digital display that I did with my partner, Lisa Strasfeld, where we programmed information to be in the complete identity style of Bloomberg and to project close up and from across the street. And they're dismantling this. So it's not so permanent, and yet the 5 in the hallway is staying. Strange. Then there's the expensive ink, fine art ink. I started making silk screens of my paintings, and the silk screens had a value, and the value increases as the silk screens sell, so that if you have an edition of 90, one of 90 is worth less than one of 25 when the edition begins to erode. When there started to be this value attached to it, it changed relationships. And the only time I've ever been engaged in a lawsuit in 40 years of work was with my first gallerist, who was actually stealing the prints because they had value. Nobody else stole my posters. As a fine artist, I began to get commissions, and that I began to think like a graphic designer, where I really was reproducing work in public spaces. So here is a diagram of a painting fitting a 2,500 square foot space in a public school in Queens. The painting was then broken into panels, repainted from the painting. Here's my original painting being repainted almost like a classic graphic reproduction and tiled into the space, but as paint. We're doing the same thing at my alma mater at Tyler, and this is just a black and white ink painting of Philadelphia that we've turned into a digital print that we've blown up into a diagram of public space and are having 300 students at Tyler fill in the white space, so I don't have to do all that work. What I do mostly, and how I really earn my living, is ink for other people. They're formats. They're designs that are plans that other people execute that I don't actually ever get to touch the ink. Things that you see that you know about, logos and identities that go out in the world that everybody sees, that are plans and you think they're forever, but they get disassembled and are just as ephemeral as the things that are made out of ink. It's funny, with Windows, I actually never touched a logo that got printed. And all the ones that were designed, which were off that chart I showed you, were designed by other people from my thought, pure plan. I did the Highline identity and their materials for about 10 years, got tired of it, and passed it on to Bobby Martin and Jennifer Kynan at OCD, and they do a better job of it than I ever did. And then here we are at MoMA, and an identity that we did in about 2007 that Julia Hoffman made visible all over New York. You know what it looks like, about to be dismantled. So is all of this indelible or ephemeral? What is it? I don't know. I can only show you sort of one experience that I think sort of sums up what we want to have happen and shows you how little control we have. And it happened to me last year and is completely accidental. I was called by my former client, George Wolfe, from the Public Theater because he was on the board of the Museum of Civil and Human Rights. And they were opening a building, a new museum, and they had a lobby, and they had intended to hang up protest posters from all over the world. And that was going to be what was in the lobby. And they framed the posters and they hung them up and they found they looked sort of dumb. And the reason they looked dumb was because the posters were from all over the world and in all different languages. If you knew the cause, you related to the poster. And if you didn't know the cause, you just thought it was kind of a bad poster. And why was it in the lobby? They didn't relate together. And it was very interesting that your emotional connection to it is that powerful. When they sent me the graphics, the only one I really responded to was the AIDS poster for Silence Equals Death, because I knew it so well. I thought, oh, well, that's a really good one. I don't know if it's a really good one. That was the one I had an emotional connection to. So I had to find a way to make these posters somehow resonate. And I had to do it as a rush job. There was no way to digitize anything or make a more dynamic display. The mural was going to be 30 feet long in the lobby. So I used a hand as a central basis, and we cut up the posters and we sort of montaged them together, which meant that the original posters were now digitized posters that were resized so they're phony. The hand was cut out and put over. It's sort of sculptural. Not one of my best pieces of work, I don't think. But it sat in the lobby of the building and was visible from the outside. And then this peculiar thing happened. People came up and they discovered if they put their hand on the glass from where you entered the building, it was the same size as the hand in the poster. Not intended. I didn't know that was going to happen. I've never even visited this place yet. I haven't been there. The night it opened, the press started photographing it that way. Then school kids started coming. They started coming and they started taking pictures of their hand. This is the stuff we pulled off the internet. It just became a thing. I don't know why it's a thing. It's a fake thing. The posters aren't real. They're not the right size. They're montaged. And here are people, they go inside and they pose in front of it. And this is John L. Lewis and his family standing in front of this mural. And I realized that the great thing about being a designer is you make these things and you put them out in the world and people relate to them and people remember them, and that's what gives them value and that's what makes them indelible. Thank you very much.